Hare Krishna, everyone. This is Achintya-Bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is part 3 of my series on the Sri Upanishad. I've lovingly called this series the Bhakti Upanishad because this Upanishad in particular is very famous in the Bhakti Yoga tradition because it explicates some of the core teachings of Bhakti Yoga. Now, if you haven't watched the invocation and part 1, mantra number 1, then make sure you watch those first. It's important to follow along in order if you can. And today we're going to be reading mantra number 2 of the 17 mantras plus the invocation. Remember that the Sri Upanishad comes from the Vedic tradition, the Vedic wisdom tradition. The Vedas are thought to be some of the oldest religious texts on the planet. The Upanishads are the ancient philosophical summaries and commentaries upon the Vedas. The Sri Upanishad in particular is called the Upanishad of the Lord. Isha means Lord or God. It was written in poetic verse. It consists of 18 verses. Now, we've read the invocation and we've read the first mantra. So we're reading mantra 2 today. We'll refresh a little bit on mantra 1 as well, but let's go into that. So here's mantra 2. One may aspire to live for hundreds of years if he continuously goes on doing work in that way, because that sort of work will not bind him to the law of karma, and there is no alternative to this way for man. Now, in this verse, we are calling back to the first mantra. So I'm going to reread that mantra from last episode. Mantra number 1. Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself which are set aside as his quota, and one must not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. So, one may aspire to live for hundreds of years if he continuously goes on doing work in that way. In which way? In the way of recognizing that we are not the controller or the owner or the possessor. That if we go on doing work, another word for work is actions. If we do actions, if we do things in the world with that realization in our mind, we can go on for hundreds of years in that way because the work or the actions that we do will not bind us to the laws of karma. And there is no alternative way for man than this. Really interesting verse. Here's the purport from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Remember, he's the monk that brought Bhakti Yoga to the United States in the 1960s. He's my guru, Vaisheshika Dasa's guru. So he's like my grandfather guru. No one wants to die, he says, and everyone wants to live for as long as he can drag on. This temperament is not only visible individually, but also it is visible collectively in the community, society, and nation. There is a hard struggle for life in every class of living entities, and the Veda says that this is quite natural for the living being. The living being is eternal by nature, but due to his bondage in the material existence, he has to change his body from one to another. This process is called transmigration of the soul. The living entity has to work for his livelihood because that is the law of material nature. And if he does not act according to the prescribed duties of his particular life, he transgresses the law of nature, making himself bound more and more in the cycle of birth and death. It's a beautiful purport to this particular verse. Remember, you can read along if you want by picking up a copy of the Sri Upanishad. I heard that they're out on Amazon, so you could always check krishnastore.com. They have a good supply of books. There's also the Bhakti Vedanta Book Trust, the BBT, if I remember correctly. You can, if you search this online, Sri Upanishad, you'll find a number of places you can order it if Amazon doesn't have it. So at any rate, and look for the A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada translation. In this purport, though, what is Prabhupada telling us? He's saying that, you know, everyone wants to live, nobody wants to die. And because we are trying to live on in a form that can't live on, right? That will die someday, we have a problem. And he goes on to say that there's a hard struggle for life in every class of living entities. It's not easy to live in the world. It feels that way now. But think of the enormous amount of human labor that has gone into creating a world where we get to live with the illusion that things are very easy. And for many people in the world, obviously, things are not easy still, right? So I live excuse me, I live in a small house, so I have like air conditioning during the summer. Um, many people don't have that, obviously. Many people don't have high standards of living in the world. What to speak of all the enormous amount of work and exploitation and you know uh, effort that went into creating a world where people could have air conditioners. And what has happened as a result of this? I speak as a total hypocrite participating in this, right? But the result is that it's really damaged the earth. So, like this, in this way, the more that we go on working as people who are clinging to life and clinging to the attempt to make happiness in a body that will die someday and happiness that will last despite impermanence, and the more we struggle and fight against those laws of nature, trying to make this as comfortable and happy and as it is, and coming from a place of fear and selfishness, the more that we become uh, entangled in the laws of karma, and that creates misery and suffering, creates cycles of misery and suffering. And some of that comes from the basic fact that, as Prabhupada is telling us, that we have not yet learned to live simply, as I said in the last talk, so that others may simply live. So the core of the Sri Isopanisad at this point is saying, when any of us learn to live, work, and act as though we are servants of the whole, as though we are servants of God, and we learn to live more simply within our means, with less desire and hankering, or with less fear, with less attachment to the temporary body. Um, we live more within our dharma, which is our essence. And when we do that, when we live within our essence, as the verse tells us, it's as though we could go on living hundreds of years. Karma won't touch us. Karma won't bind us. In fact, in ancient Vedic thinking, the span of human life has progressively decreased because of our progressively coming out of right relationship with nature. That's an idea that you'll find in the Vedic tradition. So going back again to this idea of Achintya-Bheda-Abheda tattva, oneness, simultaneous oneness and difference. We are parts of God, whole and complete unto ourselves, but also dependent upon our source. The goal being loving relationship, service, devotion to our source. Knowing that we are not alone, but dependent, we come to love our source, and our source loves us. And that's the true sense of happiness and bliss. And that's the true salvation of, you might say, that's the yoga that we're trying to reach in Bhakti Yoga. On the other hand, when we don't serve the whole of which we are a part, living within our dharma, living within right relationship to nature even, we become more and more entangled in the material energy. It creates cycles of suffering, illusion, death, and rebirth, and we keep getting caught in the same traps, the same fears, and the same selfish motivations that ultimately not only make us suffer, but make others suffer. On the other hand, when we recognize our true nature and develop love and service for God, then karma can't touch us. It's as though, uh, even though, in like the verse is saying, it's as though you could go on living for hundreds of years. So karma can't touch us when we live in that way. As a collective, now, we also can't live very long. We can't expect a society to live long or have peace or real spiritual prosperity when living simply so that others may simply live isn't our top priority. This may seem obvious, but it's actually a pretty deep, there's a deep kind of wisdom that goes along with this. I used a little picture here of a Lego castle. A Lego castle, let's say, is like the material world. And one of the things that we tend to do in the material world is that we constantly try to rearrange the Lego blocks of our material circumstances so that we can get comfortable or feel happy or avoid feeling afraid or avoid chaos. So we are constantly rearranging the things around us, the circumstances. Like if you're in a car ride, it's like, with your kids and someone in the back seat, my guru has said this before, Someone in the back seat's like, I'm too hot. Someone in the front seat's like, I'm too cold. No one can ever get comfortable, and you can't ever satisfy everyone. That's the problem with the material world, right? We have competing needs and desires and fears and so forth. So think of how hard it is individually to learn how to experience self-satisfaction in the heart, to live within our dharma, to live within our essence, to live simply, knowing that we rest upon the eternal, that we rest upon God, that we are lovers and servants of the whole, and to come into the deep, simple satisfaction of living with that kind of humility and service. It's so difficult for us to do that personally. I know I struggle with it every single day. So what to speak of how difficult it is to get a society or a civilization or a human race to act in that manner. So what do we try to do? Because we aren't focusing on that individually, and we're certainly not focusing on that collectively. Most of what we end up trying to do are to rearrange the Lego blocks to create the most security, like a fortress, like a castle that's impenetrable. Or we keep rearranging them, trying to get just the perfect fit to make us feel good. But the truth is that the more we go on trying to address the underlying problem by rearranging the Lego blocks, the more that we only become entangled in the material energy, the laws of karma, and the cycles of misery and suffering. Let's go back and read that verse one more time. One may aspire to live for hundreds of years if he continuously goes on doing work in that way. That is the spiritual way, because that sort of work will not bind him to the law of karma, and there is no alternative to this way for man. So there's two options. The first one is to just try to rearrange the Lego blocks of material stuff around us to be the most satisfying, the least fearful, etc. But it doesn't work ultimately, because it's only a rearrangement of the same stuff. We're chewing the chewed. We're playing around in our own poop. And that's literally the way that the yogic scriptures describe it. On the poop, not the Legos. They didn't have Legos yet. But the other alternative, the only other alternative, is to think about living simply so that others may simply live, and to recognizing our source, and to depending upon our source, and to loving and serving our source. That not only does that sustain us and give us peace and happiness individually, but it starts spreading out into the world. And that's the only true way, from the standpoint of Bhakti Yoga, that any kind of humanitarian endeavor could ultimately be successful. Any kind of political or cultural transformation could ever be successful if this underlying metaphysical idea is being addressed. The Srimad Bhagavatam, talking about the symptoms of a Brahmana. And the Brahmana, in an ideal kind of philosophical sense in Vedic culture, are the ones who are supposed to lead society. They're the ones who are supposed to be like the wise leaders of society, the ones who lead us as a collective. What are they like? The symptoms of a Brahmana are control of the mind, control of the senses, austerity and penance, cleanliness, satisfaction, forgiveness, simplicity, knowledge, mercy, truthfulness, and complete surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. What amazing qualities, right? We should be so lucky if we had men or women in office in any place in the world who were exhibiting even half of these qualities, right? And I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm not trying to be cynical, but that's a quality that in many ways is severely lacking. And we think, well, if we have a person of this type or this category or that category leading, or if their ideas are like this or their policies are like this or like that, then, that will solve it. But what the Bhagavatam is telling us is that actually those policies, if they aren't coming from someone who is practicing control of mind, senses, austerity and penance, cleanliness, satisfaction, forgiveness, simplicity, knowledge, mercy, truthfulness, and complete surrender to God in the heart, that if those things don't come under it, even if it looks really good and it looks like the great idea that we all could get behind, if this isn't under it, it won't be substantive. Someone in the back seat will feel like it's too hot and the war will go on. So the real need to affect change in this world on the level of society is very, very difficult from this standpoint. And the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Bhakti Yoga tradition also tell us that we're living in what's called the Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is one of a number of ages that the universe is moving through cyclically. And in this Kali Yuga, it is a dark age of dissent, corruption of religious and spiritual values, especially on the level of society. This is a description of the Kali Yuga, a few descriptions that come from the 12th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. A person in the Kali Yuga will be judged unholy if he does not have money, and hypocrisy will be accepted as a virtue. Filling the belly will become the goal of life, and one who is audacious will be accepted as truthful. The principles of religion will be observed only for the sake of reputation. As the earth becomes crowded with a corrupt population, whoever among any of the social classes shows himself to be the strongest will gain political power. So there it is, right? And in that way, when that's the status quo of how the collective is working, you can see why, from this standpoint, it's going to be so tremendously difficult to see any actual positive change, even if the ideas are good, when these values have become status quo and the general population has drifted so far from the center of a godly life, of living in love with the divinity of which we are and are a part, then it becomes very difficult to get anything ultimately progressive done. Even though something will bear the resemblance or appearance of progress, it will still be a part of the cycles of misery and suffering. So what's the solution? Well, according to this verse, until we surrender to God, both personally and collectively, and learn to work for God, learn how to wed our actions to love of God, spiritual progress in the world is not possible. Even the best intentions, if they're devoid of God consciousness, will only entangle us further. Surrender on the level of the individual is extremely challenging, precious, and rare, what to speak of seeing it on the level of the collective, and for Bhakti Yoga, especially in the Kali Yuga. So this lays upon us a great task. And that task is, it's a humble and a modest task on one level. It's a huge task on another level. The big task, the big adventure, is to start practicing and embodying love of God by thinking about God, by hearing about God, by developing conversation with God in the heart, and also by taking up some of the practices of Bhakti Yoga. Certainly, if you are going to practice Bhakti Yoga, we help cultivate that awareness of God, that voice. Sometimes we call it the conscience, but it lives in our hearts. And when it becomes awake and alive, it helps guide our actions. And we're here to act in the world. We're not here to condemn it and check out of it. We're here to be in the world and act in it. But we can't do it effectively. We can't work in a way that won't just bind us to karma endlessly unless we have wed the heart to God, because then the intelligence comes into the heart that tells us how to act and move through the world, what kind of habits and practices to come up to use in our daily lives, what spiritual health looks like, what good decision-making means in our relationships, in our jobs, with our finances, with our kids, whatever the case might be. Where does that spiritual intelligence come from? Well, it really, in this case, it comes from learning how to act and work in the right way so that we're not bound and endlessly entangled trying to solve a problem with the completely wrong ingredients to make the medicine with. So at any rate, I hope that this has been interesting. A little heavier mantra today, going into some heavier stuff. Jupiter is conjoined with Pluto as I'm speaking right now in early April of 2020. So it feels like an appropriate time to visit this verse. The next verse is really interesting as well. I can't wait to explore that with you. Until then, I would love to hear your reflections. What stuck with you? What is something you remembered? What shifted as you were listening to this, or what's been shifting as you've been listening to this series so far? I look forward to mantra number 3 coming up soon. Take it easy, everyone. Hare Krishna.